Right. So the idea is I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes about the general issue and give one very brief example, and then Felipe is going to take over and go into much more detail about the other example. And what we're going to talk about is Obama's Brain Initiative, What America Needs, or as we call it, Obi-Wan. We're going to focus on the United States and Obama's Brain Initiative in particular, just because there are differences among the different brain mapping initiatives, and so we wanted a fairly concrete purpose, and a fairly concrete example to talk about. And basically, our thesis is going to be that the mere data is not going to be enough to accomplish the goals of the Brain Initiative. That what we really need instead is some kind of conceptual revolution through which we can view the data in a new way in order to understand better what's going on. Okay? But to figure out what we need, we got to know what the goals are. And there are many goals of Obama's Brain Initiative, many admirable goals of Obama's Brain Initiative. Some of them are purely medical. I mean, everybody's in favor of curing the diseases that depend on problems in the brain. And so, certainly in favor of that. But we're instead going to focus on the one that we as philosophers are more interested in. And I just wanted to confirm that we're not making this up. This is supposed to be the goal. You've already heard it from many of the speakers. We want to understand ourselves. The White House says we want to understand how brain function is linked to human behavior and learning. The NIH says, how are those circuits in the brain allow us to do all the complicated things that we currently don't understand? Not the simple things, the complicated things. And the Allen Institute says to understand how brain activity leads to perception, decision-making, and ultimately action, right? So the goals are quite big, not just to understand the circuits, but to understand how they're linked to behavior of the most complex sorts in our human lives. How are they going to do that? That's the question. Well, we're going to look in particular, again, it's nice to have a focus, we're going to look at the interim report of the NIH committee, and they put forward 9 proposals. Generate a census of cell types, create structural maps of the brain, develop new large-scale network recording capabilities, develop a suite of tools for circuit manipulation, link neuronal activity to behavior, integrate theory, modeling, statistics, computation with experimentation, delineate mechanisms underlying human imaging technologies, create mechanisms to enable collection of human data, and disseminate knowledge and training. First thing I want to point out is this is a typical kind of government. It's like, we want it all. Like, there's all this great stuff. I mean, I'd love to have all of these things, and we're not going to be opposed to any of it. Our question is really going to be, what do we need to accomplish those goals, through these mechanisms? Which of these stages are really going to be doing the work? Okay? So the first 2, generate a census of cell types and create structural maps of the brain. Again, great idea, but and that's the good news. It's not just a list. It's going to be connections among them. So we're going to get a real map like the U.S. with the different parts connected and arranged. Okay? But the bad news is this is going to be far from understanding mind and behavior, especially of the complex sort. Just compare trying to understand U.S. society by mapping the roads. Right? If you just map the roads and show the connections and figure out the physical things, you're not going to understand the society. Merely doing the map, it might be essential, it might not. It kind of depends. I think it probably is, but it's certainly not going to be sufficient. It's not going to accomplish the goals. And I want to echo a point that Rosa made earlier, which is, it's not just the U.S. If our individual brains are actually mapped in different ways, it's like trying to do a joint map of all the different countries in the world, because there are going to be differences among the maps as well, although there will certainly be similarities. The next 2 are large-scale network recording capabilities, suite of tools for circuit manipulation. Absolutely. This is great stuff because it's going to allow us to test causal relations. But the bad news is that we need some guidance about what to record and what to manipulate. This point was made before. If you start in this giant mass of neurons, and you start just randomly picking ones to manipulate, the odds of actually hitting the ones that are of interest are very slim. That would be kind of like trying to understand society by picking random people and changing them and seeing what's going to happen to these other people. If you don't know where to focus and you don't have a theoretical question that's guiding you, then it's unlikely that that's going to be very illuminating. Okay? So the next two delineate the mechanisms underlying human imaging technologies. Actually, let's go to this one too. Create mechanisms to enable collection, disseminate knowledge and training. Who could be against this stuff? I'm in favor of all these things too. But the question, the good news is, of course, now we're getting to humans. The bad news is it's a bunch of information that we've now got these underlying mechanisms. We've enabled the collection, sure, but if you've just got a collection of data and you don't have, again, a theoretical question to guide you, then collecting that data, you're not going to know what to look for, and you're not going to get anywhere. My example here is the IBM Train Cars. This is one of my favorite stories. IBM one time was sued by somebody for some kind of financial irregularity, and the people on the other side said, we want all of your financial records from September to December of 1963 or whatever. And IBM said, all of them? And we can't give you all of them. And the judge said, give them all. And of course, there were like 10 train cars filled with documents, and they didn't know what they were looking for, so they never found it, and it never did any good. If they had had a more specific goal about what they were looking for, they would have been more successful. Now, these are the items that we think that's where the action is, right? Linking neuronal activity to behavior for the purposes that we're talking about here. Integrating theory, modeling statistics, and computation with experimentation. So we're in favor of all this stuff. This is where we think the good news is for the purposes that we quoted at the beginning. The question is, how are we going to link the brain to behavior? How are we going to integrate the theory and the computation together? Okay? And our suggestion is that you need to study mind and behavior, not just the brain. If you don't have the psychological innovations and improvements alongside the neurological information, then you're not really going to understand how these things are linked at all. We need to understand them all together. The disadvantage of coming at the end of the afternoon is many of these points have been made before, right? You have to do them at the same time. You can't kind of say, well, let's wait till we know everything there is about the brain and we have them all mapped out and all the connections, and then we'll start wondering about how it links up to psychological categories or other categories, as we'll talk about in a second. You have to do them in tandem. And in particular, we're going to argue that probably you have to be willing to go well beyond old categories, beyond folk psychology. And where are we going to get these new concepts from? We think they should be data-driven. So I'm going to give one very simple example of this, and then Felipe will go into much more detail about another. My lab works on moral judgments, and this is Parkinson et al. In, I can't remember, 2011, I guess, Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience. And what we did is we looked at moral judgments. Well, moral judgments or moral beliefs are kind of a common sense category that people use in their everyday life, and so you want to know how they're based in the brain. But it turns out that when you distinguish them into different subtypes, harmful, dishonest, disgusting, you get totally different brain activations. So things that look like they're getting clumped together with our common folk psychological concepts end up being extremely different. And by the way, if you do physical harm versus emotional harm, you get even more separation. Okay? So you can't study the neural basis of moral judgments in general. You need a new category to guide you. And sometimes you're going to get connections that are quite surprising. For example, Ming Xu's paper in 2008 Science looks like the part of the brain that's connected to people's judgments about unfair distribution of resources is actually closely related to the part of the brain that's been connected by other studies to incest. and cannibalism avoidance. And you never would have guessed that. If you didn't have the brain data, you wouldn't have put those things together in the same way. So the brain data can drive us to develop new concepts that we think will be fruitful towards answering those questions that the Brain Initiative was created to answer. Felipe will give you a much more detailed example.
Which one is the pointer?
That's the one.
All right, so we believe that there's an important conceptual challenge here, and that the Brain Initiative requires us to reconsider the concept. So what is the structure of that challenge specifically? Well, to a certain extent, many cognitive neuroscientists, people in particular working neuroimaging like I do, used to have this naive or implicit assumption to the fact that there will be somewhat of a smooth transition from false psychological concepts to neural concepts. So you study something like remembering, and then you find some neural correlate of remembering, you study emotion, and you find some neural correlate, and so on and so forth. In fact, yesterday I Google search, and I filtered by keywords having to do with neuroimaging methods, and I get about 1,200 neuroimaging papers that include in the title the sentence, the neural correlates of X, where X is some sort of false psychological term like romantic love, agency, self-knowledge, and so on and so forth. But in reality, when you start looking at how these papers and the kind of data this paper presents, it looks as though almost every brain region appears to be engaged in all sorts of different cognitive processes during all sorts of different experimental tasks. And in particular, what I was trying to convey here is that there are different probabilities of there being some correlation. So some cognitive processes are very highly probably engaged with some brain regions, and there is some probability they're engaged with some others, and so forth. So in reality, what it looks as though is that far from being a one-to-one relation between the cognitive or folk psychological level and the neural level, and not even a one-to-many relation, the picture appears to be much more complex. It appears to be a relation of many-to-many. Okay, so nowadays, what people seem to be doing rather is to try to explain this common engagement of specific brain regions in diverse cognitive functions across diverse experimental tasks by way of accounting for such functional roles in terms that are neither psychological nor neurological. So I'm just going to give you an example of the actually hippocampus, because that's what I work on. Here's a nice image of the hippocampus focused on my favorite y coordinate, -22. If you look at any of my papers, you know why I like it so much. And here you see the hippocampal complex with the hippocampus proper and the perirenal and entorhinal cortices. So whenever you open a book, an introductory book on cognitive neuroscience, then people say like, oh, the hippocampus, that's super important for memory. And we know that it's very important for memory because if you don't have a hippocampus, you're not going to be able to encode new information. We know that from work in rats. We know that for HM and for all sorts of individuals who have damage in the temporal lobes. So for a while, people were thinking, oh, look, there is a nice correlation between hippocampus and memory. So memory is up here, and then you correlate it with hippocampus. And similar things have been said about regions like Broca's area and so on. But it turns out that as cognitive psychologists start doing more and more studies, it turns out that not all kinds of memory are related to hippocampal activity. Only some kinds of memory are related to hippocampal activity. Particularly, they were thinking, declarative, but non-declarative memory is not related to hippocampus. It turns out that that's also not a very good classification, because not every aspect of declarative memory is engaged or engages hippocampus, only encoding according to certain views, although there are certain views that suggest that the hippocampus is also required for memory retrieval. So people start making amendments. And those amendments include like, hey, well, maybe the hippocampus is not really a correlate of memory, it's just the correlate of the gateway of encoding information in long-term memory or something like that. And then I imagine people need to keep doing experiments because they want to really understand what the hippocampus is doing. So they start testing people that have mediotemporal lobe damage in different tasks. One of my favorite results that basically guided all my PhD research is that individuals that have mediotemporal lobe damage and also individuals that have damage specifically to the hippocampal complex have also a terrible time imagining what they might do in the future. So we all know that if you lose your memory, you're really, really bad at remembering what happened in the past. That's kind of like the definition, right? But it turns out that individuals that have miotemporal lobe damage, specifically to the hippocampal complex, are also terribly bad at imagining themselves what will happen in the future. If you ask an individual with a miotemporal lobe damage, hey, what are you going to do for Christmas? The answer that it's going to give you is very semanticized. Well, I guess there's going to be, a tree and presents. But if you ask them to sort of picture themselves in the future, they're terribly bad at that. So they said, hey, turns out that they are really, really good at giving you a very semanticized version of what is going to happen in the future, but not when it's more like an episodic future thinking. My own research also suggests that it is not only in the future thinking, but also when you think in alternative ways in which your past could have been. But it turns out that not all counterfactuals about your past are engaged the hippocampus, only those that you think are likely. When you think that a counterfactual is very unlikely it could have happened, you're fine. But if you think that it is very likely it could have happened, you'll have difficulty and you require more hippocampal engagement. And furthermore, some people have started to look, well, the hippocampus is kind of like at the end of the temporal lobe, and we all know that the visual ventral stream ends up in the hippocampus, so maybe the hippocampus has something to do with perception as well. There's beautiful research coming from the University of Toronto by Morgan Berense and her lab, showing that there's certain perceptual tasks that actually engage the hippocampus. And lo and behold, you ask individuals that have mediotemporal lobe damage to perform certain highly difficult or certain perceptual tasks that require binding, and it turns out that they also have difficulty doing this. So you make further amendments. And what are those amendments? Well, only certain kinds of imagination, those that are involve the self, and they have to do with the future and some sort of hypothetical thinking, but not all of them. And that involve spatial coherent scene and so on and so forth. And only certain kinds of processes. So at the end of the day, you end up is something very, very strange. You end up with what is the hippocampus doing? Well, the hippocampus might be some sort of module that calls for sensory independent conjunctions of spatial features. Well, that is neither a psychological nor a neurological term. So to feed the many-to-many variability in the data, what seems to happen now is that theories are postulating additional intermediate and probably tiered sub-processes that are described in terms that are neither psychological nor neurological. And just to give you an idea of how this is a paper that came 3 months ago by from the lab of Eleanor Maguire and Sinnott-Armstrong. Is a theoretical paper trying to manifest it as networks of nodes connected among themselves. So one way in which you can do this is you get data for anatomical parcellation. We have different strategies to do anatomical parcellation. You can start off using just very broadly defined Brodmann areas. I particularly like recent parcellations that are coming from Peterson's lab at WashU that are using probability distributions of a certain action, certain activity falling within a certain region. But whichever you take as the strategy for parcellation, you take the data from here, and in addition to that, you do whatever task you're interested in, and this task will give you certain locuses of activity. Then you put the two of two together, and then you end up with something like a network map. So this is very neat because then you can have like attention-related tasks, and then they give you a specific kind of mapping. You can have like memory-related tasks and give you a different kind of mapping. And some people have, tried to factor what is the minimum number of networks that can account for the majority of the data, and then you can get something like 17 networks and so on. So this is really cool, but then what do you do next? The next step is to try to correlate these different networks. So this is an example. This example uses a slightly different method of correlation called partial least squared that I won't get into the details. But what I want to point attention in this dendrogram is we have 3 different networks here. This is the control network, this is the frontoparietal attention network, and this is the default network. And then what you can see, the colors indicate the strength of the correlation. So you can see that certain nodes are more correlated among themselves, and that there's certain nodes that also have further correlation within and between networks. So what this allows you to see is like, look, depending on the task, it might be possible that the control network kind of shifts connectivity to the attention network and further to the default network. So the next step that you want to do after this is to explore network interactions across different tasks. So in other words, how does the attention network interact with the default network and in turn with the control network while you're trying to pick an apple versus when you're trying to remember something that happened in the past. This is an example along those directions, except that this is done during default or resting state connectivity, come out from Randy Buckner's lab and collaborators. And then what they are looking here is a similar kind of dendrogram in which what you have is very, very high correlation among like the same brain regions, but you can also, the same networks, but you can also see how networks interact between one another when they are correlated with default activity versus when they are anti-correlated. So you can very easily imagine an extra dimension here in which what you have is not only default or resting state connectivity, but you can have 2, 3, 4, or 5 different kinds of tasks and see how they interact with one another. So I like that approach, but I'm not entirely wedded to the idea that this might be the right approach. It might be possible that there are other approaches. But suppose that this approach, that we all like follow this approach and that we decide that something like network theory should be the mathematical structure by means of which we're going to explain a lot of this data. So what to do next? We want to explain cognition. Remember, that's what Obama asked us to do. So what are we going to do next? Well, collect data. A lot of data. So give money to people that do humans and not only animals. Generate large matrices of network interactions across experimental tasks. We need a lot of computational power to do this, but you can do it. And then start looking for stable patterns. And now go back to philosophy and go back to Husserl and unbracket those false psychological categories and see if they match your patterns or not. If they do, great, publish them in PNAS. And if they don't, then start figuring out how you're going to be able to account for the data. So let me just give you a very quick example that I really like. I work on memory, and I am very interested in trying to understand why is it that episodic memory comes with autonoetic consciousness, and why is it that semantic memory doesn't. And we know that there is a very porous interaction, like the boundaries between episodic and semantic memory are incredibly porous. And some people are now suggesting that maybe we shouldn't consider consciousness to be the wager between episodic memory and semantic memory. It's rather about mental representations or rather brain representations. That's great, but I still want to know why is it that when I remember that Caracas is the capital of Venezuela, I don't figure myself, I don't put myself in that context. But when I remember my first kiss, I do. I want to know why is it that this this experiential component of my feeling memory comes accompanied in one kind of brain representation and not in other. This is data that you cannot dispose of. It's data that needs to be fit. So do that and create better concepts that might explain the data better. And to do that, I suggest ask a philosopher. We're good at that. So conclusions. Remember, what the Brain Initiative wants to do is to understand how the brain links cognition to behavior. The data without concept is going to be blind. You need concepts, right, to guide that data. But of course, you need the right concepts. You cannot give up because your patterns do not seem to look like pre-theoretical concepts. You have to probably jettison them and come up with better ones. So the take-home message is, get this goal, we need some sort of conceptual revolution. Thank you.